First News with Keeler in the morning on WIBX and WIBX950.com.
Could make people uncomfortable, and when you're in that type of a position, you need to be sensitive and aware of how you're undertaking your responsibilities and your behavior accordingly.
Yeah. You know what is sad, and I understand there are things that people have, like I think the SAFE Act was a tough moment for a lot of people and a deal breaker for a lot of people in upstate New York. He had problems with education at times. The Common Core thing was a debacle. But when you look at the stuff that he has actually done, what he did for the state fair and the state fairgrounds, what he's done for Cuomo single-handedly, and I know you'll disagree with this, Joe, because the legislature in a lot of these situations had to vote on this. But the reality, his push towards microbreweries and wine in New York, homegrown, all of that stuff, huge for New York State. The work that he did in our area, the money that was allowed to filter into this area played such a huge role. He's blown all of those positives. He's blown them all up.
Yeah, as we talked about, Bill, to be fair here, as we started his tenure as governor, there was a good working relationship. I think he governed from the middle. He was able to bring people together, and we were able to jointly do many of the things you said, to identify an issue and to work collectively to try to resolve that, including directing resources, financial resources to upstate New York, doing various other initiatives and programs that initially during the first term, like an on-time budget, things of that nature, those were important and necessary, but it was a collective. It was not just strictly him. It was also jointly with the legislature. And then later, as he went in, he became much more stubborn, as you indicated, and much more egocentric. And then he would use the tactics of intimidation or retribution. And he was always known for some of that. He had a very hard-nosed personality. And I think a lot of that just become the basis for his not only his position, but his performance as he moved on. And as you indicated earlier, Bill, I think a lot of this he began to believe that he was untouchable.
He drank his own Kool-Aid. And I hate to say this because I always disagree with you on term limits, because I feel like that it should be in the hands of the public. And if they want to keep voting somebody in, vote somebody in. But if there is ever an example of term limits and the importance of term limits, it's Andrew Cuomo. Yeah. Because the longer he stayed, the more invincible and untouchable he felt, the more the job went to his head, it seems.
Yeah, the term limits, I think, really having served as long as I have, too, and people will say, well, why don't you undertake what you're proposing? I've always said to you that I'm working to change the rules, but until the rules change, I'll play by the rules that exist. But those changes are necessary. I've now believed through my experience and time in government, term limits is one of the real reasons and ways that we can change direction, that we can change and revitalize the process. You cannot keep anyone, whether it's in the legislature or the executive branch, for that many years. 8 years is sufficient. It's sufficient for the presidency. It can be for any governor. In Virginia, it's actually only 4 years. It's a one-term limit, and they get things done. And even in the legislature, when you have speakers and majority leaders that serve for long periods of time, you're right. You're more prone and susceptible to problems. And so I think a short tenure in those positions, and I don't think 8 years is that short, it's sufficient, or in the legislature, 12 years. And I was actually successful in getting term limits on the leaders of the legislature, in the Senate at least. The Assembly refused to undertake and consider the same. But in the Senate, our leadership there will serve the temporary president of the Senate, majority leader, and minority leader can only serve for 8 years unless they change the rule. Okay. That's a rule that I had advocated and was successful in getting implemented. I'd like to see that in law, though, not only as a rule.
Keeler and I argued about something this morning about the Attorney General's office conducting the investigation, and then at the podium talking about the conclusions that they had come to. And the case, as far as the Attorney General's office is concerned, is kind of over. They've done what they're going to do. They're not going to go any further with it. What was your take on that?
Well, that's really the role and responsibility of Attorney General. And, in fact, if you recall, that's what Andrew Cuomo did, actually, during the Spitzer era, when there was a question of as to whether or not the governor then, Spitzer, was using the state police to monitor then Majority Leader Joe Bruno. So there was, and Andrew Cuomo did the report that came out, and it was pretty damning to Spitzer at the time, that he was inappropriately directing activity and resources. So
they form conclusions. They form conclusions. Not that might very well mean there could be a trial down the road. And certainly in government there's impeachment, but they do form conclusions. But I think this argument that Jeff has goes back to what Cuomo, his attorneys laid this out, that he was unfairly convicted by the Attorney General.
Well, right, well, and that's what they said. But Senator, let me ask you: at what point does the AG take an investigation to a courtroom and prosecute it versus they conduct an investigation and then announce publicly what their findings are on it?
That's an excellent point, Jeff, and that remains a point of contention actually in Albany, because currently, while they can undertake those type of activities as you've indicated in some of the criminal justice matters, they can't do this in the political arena. And it was done intentionally at one point when, I guess, the framers put the Constitution together to ensure that you could not go on political witch hunts. So the Attorney General can undertake investigations, particularly when it's referred or requested, and then just present that report. Now, there has been some discussion of empowering the Attorney General to prosecute political activity also. But again, there's a question there because even though they hold the highest law enforcement office in the state, they are a political office because that individual is elected also, just no different than the governor, the controller, or members of the legislature. So I think that's been the argument. I think you'll see some people now begin to push again to give these type of powers to the Attorney General. But there's going to be others that will say, well, what if you get an Attorney General who goes rogue and wants to go after people?
Joe, can I clarify?
Remember, Cuomo authorized the investigation too.
You're saying that she could not have gone through and prosecuted?
Correct, under the political issues like under sexual harassment and things. Any of the not that it's a political issue, but what I'm saying is within that arena, within that realm.
Yep. I think it's this has been floated by the governor's attorneys last week that he was unfairly that the AG unfairly came to conclusions and basically convicted him in her report. And what I'm saying is that's what every attorney general does. That's what they all do. That they come to their conclusion, and then whatever process goes forward is where it goes. I just think that's a great argument they try to throw out there, but they know what they're throwing out there is not true. They know it.
I think you have an accurate assessment, Bill, and what you've presented, and I understand what they're saying because you do have the court of public opinion,
right? And
in that court of public opinion is where things began to move against him, and but they had the opportunity to present his own perspective to a certain extent. And if there is criminal charges that are pressed, ultimately they'll have an opportunity to present that also. Now, if any of these DAs move forward on the complaints that may be filed, I believe one has already been filed. Then they'll have the opportunity to present their case too. But in the end, it comes to what we discussed where we started, and it's about behavior and conduct and the way you present yourself and what you have represented to be important to you. And then to do differently and to act differently and to think potentially, well, this applies to you, but not to me. And then to say, well, I wasn't aware or believed I was doing anything wrong when you were the author. These are the things that really where you lost credibility and it becomes very disappointing, and actually frustrating too, to a certain extent because we deserve and need better here in the state of New York.
No doubt about it. Joe, we appreciate the time. Thank you so much. And
my pleasure.
You have a wonderful day. Say goodbye to Angelo. He's leaving us, going back to college to study comedy.
What's a college semester, though? 6 weeks nowadays? He'll be back in no time.
He'll be back before you know it. Say goodbye to him.
Good luck, Angelo.
Bye, Uncle Joe.
Okay.
Take care.
Okay. All right, Joe. Thank you so much.